In this video, Natalie executes a cross and a rear hook, two of the basic strikes in boxing. She begins in her stance phase, which is known as the boxing stance. She stands with her left foot forward and her hip slightly flexed, and her right foot back and her hip slightly extended. She stands with her weight on the balls of her feet. Her trunk is upright and neutral, and she holds her hands by her chin, meaning that her shoulders are adducted and slightly flexed. Her elbows are flexed and her wrists are neutral. She has her hands in composite fists with the MPs and IPs of all of her digits flexed and the CMCs of her thumbs palmarly abducted. Her head is slightly protracted in order to allow it to stay behind her hands. Her preparatory phase is also in the boxing stance. However, now her muscles are beginning to contract as she is deciding which punch she will throw. First, she will throw a cross. Her trunk slightly flexes and rotates as she shifts her weight forward onto her left foot, farther extending her right hip. This causes plantar flexion of her right foot and ankle as her heel lifts off the floor, but the ball of her foot stays in place. She throws the punch with her right arm, so her shoulder flexes, her elbow extends, and her forearm pronates. Her scapula also protracts as she punches through the bag, or in this case, our roommate and our squishmallow. Her left side, however, does not stay still as her scapula elevates slightly to protect her face with her hand. Her follow-through phase in this returns back to her boxing stance. This includes her scapula retracting back to neutral, her shoulder slightly extending back to neutral, and her elbow flexing again as her forearm turns or supinates back to neutral as well. Her movement phase is her action of throwing the punch, while her follow-through phase is the action of returning back to her boxing stance from the point of impact. When Natalie throws her hook, her movement phase is again the punch. This includes slight extension of her trunk as well as more rotation as she internally rotates her right hip. Her left arm, again, has slight scapular elevation to protect her face. On her right side, her shoulder abducts and then horizontally adducts as her elbow slightly extends but stays flexed at around 90 degrees. Her wrist and forearm remain neutral. Her follow-through phase again brings her back to her boxing stance, in which her shoulder of her right side externally rotates and adducts, her elbow flexes tightly, and her hands return back to her face. Finally, her recovery phase is yet again in her boxing stance. Natalie begins in her boxing stance. She throws her cross and returns to her boxing stance. She then throws her hook and returns to her boxing stance again. She moves from her stance phase through her preparatory phase, into her movement phase, back through her follow phase, into her recovery phase, which doubles again as her stance phase, to allow her to move back through her preparatory phase, into a movement phase, through her follow-through phase, back to her final recovery phase.
Nailed it.